Hello everyone. I'm gonna have to get real close here so you can't see me, but I'm talking right in the microphone because it's kind of loud out here. Some people built Pells over Christmas and are using them now. People built Pells earlier. There was some request as to some things we can do with Pells. The first one that I'm going to show you is basically our measure drill, where you are going to approach from outside of measure, see if you're in your measure, and make a cut. Use your good footwork when you are approaching, use your good footwork when you're making the cut. Nice clean cuts with extended arms. And we're trying to hit somewhere in the top, 10 inches or so of our longswords. And that's where you should be aiming for. You'll see that on my Pell I have a tire over it. I like the feeling of hitting the tire better than like the feeling of hitting the plain wood. I know some people have cord wrappings, that's also just fine. Just hit the wood as you feel. And so I'm aiming for sort of the outside of the tire. That's my target, or the inside lip of the tire if that's where I'm coming from at the front. I suggest using any and all cuts. I suggest using any and all footwork online and offline, and seeing if you can't drill in your measure a little bit better. And now I'm going to show some of that. So, if you're going to do it with one cut and find your measure, offline footwork, both sides, many different types of cuts, then I suggest, once that's comfortable, adding a second cut while in measure. And so, because the book tells us to step with our cuts, then what our steps become are not forward and backward, but a little bit more lateral. You can take that passing step forward, land that forward cut, and then take a lateral step to throw another cut from the side. I'd also suggest trying to figure that out without the step, because that's a real situation you'll face. So drill with the second step, get into that habit of taking that second lateral step, but also learn to do it without it. They're both valuable situations to be able to fight it. You'll notice in that last one that I didn't connect the first cut. That's another option you have in this, is to feint and then take the second cut. Keeping in mind, and the reason we do this with the feint, is that you should feint while in measure as if the hit was going to hit. Feints are not meant to be outside necessarily, unless you're trying to get a reaction to move, but we should also be able to think about, in that forward motion, the feint, the pull, and the next cut. Okay? You'll see me moving back and forth often. It is a common technique to cut at one side that causes the defense to move in a certain direction, and then cut in the opening that's created. It's a good habit to get into. In later Saber manuals, they specifically state feints and second cuts should come at 90 degrees or at 180 degrees from the initial cut. Because of this, though, a lot of people will initially defend into the previously opened space. So if I cut top right and the defense moves towards that, top left becomes an easy opening. If I cut top right, bottom left becomes a good opening. Because a lot of that is drilled and a lot of people understand the reality of defending in one position means opening another sometimes, there's often a knee-jerk reaction to defend that space. That is something that we can utilize. And so it's also important to train a cut in the same opening. So it looks like it's, for example, a sphere that you pull as if you're going to do another sphere and transitioning back to the same position. So I will show you the 90 degree, so the different openings, and then I will show you the same opening. You'll notice it's often a little bit harder to feint away from where you were and go back to where you started, and that requires a slightly different cut mechanic. But you can play with that at home and figure that out for yourself. You'll always have talked or heard me talk about the ideal way to cut cuts, mechanics to use, body chain to use, and then not use that if you're cutting in the same space sometimes can be a little counterintuitive. But it's something to play with. The other thing to practice, I think, is to cut out of measure and then take a second step to close that distance and hit with a thrust. We've done this in class as well. You cut, and then you find yourself in an extended hanging guard of some description, either a long point style in the middle, or better yet, rolling up into a hanging ox of some variety and stabbing from there with protection from above. Looks like this. So I use the Oberhau, but you can obviously use any initial cut. It's fair, something people will get out of your way when you cut sometimes in sparring or in a tournament, and then you'll have to take that extra step to hit them if they didn't retreat fully. So practice that with all of your cuts. Okay, things like a sphere can end in a good position for this, where you will step, you will cut, and you'll be in this extended position, and then you just have to walk, and you'll be there. So practice that as well. Okay, so we have cut with the measure, cut in the measure, have a second cut. We have that in an opposite opening with a step. We have that in the same opening without a step. And we have it in an opposite opening without a step. So these are all options for you to drill. We have cutting out of measure and then thrusting, either in that sort of long point style position or with the roll up into something more like a hanging ox. A bit of a wind. That's longsword. Any and all of this also applies for our friends who do saber. With the saber, the concept is the same. Start out of measure, cut when you're in measure. Do all the variations as well. The only one that for a lot of people will feel different is thrusting, because a lot of saber systems don't put as much emphasis on that as perhaps mine does. So what I'm going to show is the cutting out of measure and then the winding into a safe position to do the thrust. Winding into a safe position to do the thrust, in my system specifically, ends up with you in what is the parrying position, which is that hanging guard. or hanging guard. Well, not actually a guard, but essentially the same thing on the other side, but inverted. Okay? You see here, you see the back of my hand with the nails, the knuckles facing up. On this side, you see the back of my hand with the knuckles facing up, and that's intentional and that's structural, but it's wound around. So we're going to cut out of measure and then wind up into the thrust, or cut out of measure and wind up into the thrust on the other side. All of these things are quite straightforward. They're pretty simple, but they're all good ways to get a little impact exercise in. That's a good grip training thing, I find. It's a good point control thing if you put yourself a target on the Pell. For a lot of people, the Pell itself, if it's just the 4x4, is a great thing to start with. You can't see it, but I have a small hole drilled in various points on the Pell, and I actually target those specifically as well. So, basic Pell exercises that I think are useful. I hope that helps. Let me know if there's anything else you guys think could be helpful while we're still shut down. Have a good one.